David thought he'd found the deal of a lifetime, a full house for just $1,800. But the moment he moved in, the warning started. Don't open the locked door. At first, he laughed it off, but then came the metallic stench seeping through the halls, the tapping at night, and the cold air leaking from beneath the doorframe. One stormy night, unable to resist, David broke it open, only to find a room carved with strange symbols, scattered bones, and notes that read only one thing: seal. Contain. Never open. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, we'd love for you to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Your support means the world and helps us bring you even more powerful stories. Stick with us until the end, and if this mystery moves you, share your thoughts in the comments and pass it along to a friend. David couldn't believe the listing when he first saw it. A 2-story home, weathered but standing, offered for just $1,800, less than the price of a new laptop. The photos showed cracked shutters, ivy climbing the brick, windows clouded by dust. To him, it wasn't a ruin, it was an opportunity. The paperwork was fast, almost too easy. The agent slid the keys across the table with a shrug, avoiding his eyes. "It's yours," she muttered, then added, almost under her breath, "Just don't go messing with what's locked inside." David laughed it off. A bargain was a bargain, yet when he drove into town the next day, word had already spread. At the diner, 2 men eyed him from their booth. "So you're the guy who bought that place," one said, shaking his head. The other smirked. "You'll see. Some doors aren't meant to open." The house stood waiting at the end of a narrow lane, its roof sagging, porch boards groaning under his weight. The wind hissed through broken shingles. It wasn't just an old house. It felt watchful, as though it had been waiting for someone foolish enough to step inside. David pushed open the front door, the stale air wrapping around him like a warning. And for the first time, the price made sense. David wasn't the kind of man who usually jumped at haunted bargains. At 32, he'd spent most of his adult life chasing stability. Steady job, modest car, a string of rented apartments that all looked the same. What drew him to the house wasn't greed or thrill-seeking, but exhaustion. He wanted something that was his, a place with walls that held his stories, not someone else's. The $1,800 price tag felt almost absurd. His coworkers joked he was throwing money away. "Bro, it's not a home, it's a demolition project," one teased. David grinned, brushing off their laughter. "Then I'll rebuild it," he said. "Cheaper than rent, anyway." But the whispers began, even before he signed the deed. At the hardware store, an older man muttered while ringing up paint supplies, "That house should have been torn down. Nothing good in there." At the grocery line, a woman clucked her tongue. "Hope you're not planning to stay long." None gave specifics, just warnings coded in vagueness. David chalked it up to small-town superstition. He was an outsider. People liked their stories. Besides, he'd always been pragmatic. A leaky roof, sagging floors, even the smell of mildew, those were problems a hammer and elbow grease could fix. What unnerved him, though, was the way people shifted when he mentioned the locked room. The agent's words echoed, "Don't go messing with what's locked inside." At the diner, when he mentioned exploring every part of his new investment, a man dropped his fork mid-bite and muttered, "Leave that alone." Still, David wasn't easily swayed. He told himself all houses had quirks, locked doors, and secrets. His plan was simple: fix it up, live in it, maybe even flip it one day. But as he walked the creaking halls his first night, flashlight beam gliding over peeling wallpaper and hollow-eyed portraits, he couldn't shake the feeling that the whispers weren't about creaks or cracks. They were about something else, something waiting, hidden just out of sight. And David, despite the warnings, was the type who couldn't resist knowing. David spent his first night on an old mattress tossed in the living room, the walls breathing with every gust of wind. The silence inside was heavier than he expected. No hum of traffic, no neighbors through thin walls, just the groan of the house settling as if it remembered being abandoned. By morning, the flaws were clearer. Wallpaper bubbled and peeled like old skin. Floorboards sagged under his weight, each step releasing a tired sigh. The air smelled of damp wood and rust, a mix that clung to his clothes even after he stepped outside. Exploring room by room, David noticed strange details. In the kitchen, every cabinet door hung loose, except one nailed shut with rusted screws. Upstairs, a hallway mirror leaned face first against the wall, covered in a yellowing sheet. And then, at the far end of the second floor, he found it. A door locked tight, its frame darker than the surrounding wood, as though it had been handled countless times. He tugged the handle once, twice, solid. The memory of the agent's warning returned, sharp as glass. Don't go messing with what's locked inside. David smirked, telling himself he'd deal with it later. But even as he turned away, he felt it. The house wasn't just old. It was waiting. By the end of the week, David was a fixture in town. People recognized him instantly, not for who he was, but for what he had done. "That's the guy who bought the old house," they whispered when he walked into the diner, when he browsed the shelves at the hardware store, when he filled his truck at the gas station. The house had made him a curiosity, maybe even a fool in their eyes. Conversations hushed when he entered, but not fast enough. He caught pieces of talk. "Place should have stayed empty. Doesn't know what he's walking into." At the barber shop, two older men spoke loud enough for him to hear, almost daring him to react. "You couldn't pay me to sleep in that place. Locked up for a reason." The other chuckled, shaking his head. "New blood always thinks they're smarter than the rest of us. Till they learn." When David asked directly, people dodged. The waitress at the diner avoided his eyes, dropping off his coffee and muttering, "Some things you leave alone." At the post office, a clerk leaned in and said flatly, "If you're smart, you won't open it," then quickly turned away. The warnings weren't detailed, but they were constant. It was like the whole town shared a secret, one they weren't willing to speak out loud. And that made it worse, because the vagueness gnawed at David's mind. Back at the house, the words followed him. The locked door upstairs seemed louder somehow, as though every creak of the floorboards pulled him toward it. Even when he tried to focus on repairs, patching leaks, hauling out trash, sanding down windows, the thought lingered. What were they so afraid of? What had been sealed away in a house bought for pennies on the dollar? At night, when wind pushed against the warped shutters, David lay awake listening. The gossip wasn't just in town anymore. It had followed him home, pressing against the locked door like a whisper he couldn't shake. And he hated whispers. He needed answers. The first sign came as a smell, not mildew or dust. That was everywhere already, but something sharper, metallic, like rust mixed with earth. It seeped faintly from the upstairs hallway, strongest near the locked door. At night, David swore he heard tapping. Faint, irregular, as if a pipe knocked behind the wall. Once, as he passed the door with a load of trash, the handle gave the slightest rattle, though no draft stirred the air. He crouched once, peering through the thin crack beneath the frame. Darkness, but the air that slid out was colder than the rest of the house, carrying that same strange scent. Downstairs, while tearing up warped floorboards, he found nails bent in odd angles, as if someone had pried them up and hammered them back again in a hurry. In the basement, dust lay heavy across everything, except a single narrow trail leading straight toward the staircase that ended under the locked room. David told himself it was nothing. Houses had smells, pipes shifted, wood creaked, but every clue pointed upward, toward the one door he wasn't supposed to open. And the more he told himself to leave it alone, the stronger the pull became. David tried to ground himself in routine. He woke early, brewed strong coffee in the kitchen, and tackled repairs one by one. He scrubbed walls until his arms ached, hauled out broken furniture, and patched roof tiles under the late summer sun. He told himself this was what the house needed, attention, not fear. But the house had other plans. Every time he thought he'd settled in, something shifted. Light bulbs flickered, though the wiring tested fine. Doors he swore he'd shut were found cracked open. One morning, his toolbox sat in the hallway upstairs. He hadn't carried it there. The smell grew stronger. Sometimes it hit him like a wave when he climbed the stairs, metallic and damp, seeping from the locked door. He bought air fresheners, even burned sage he'd picked up from a shop downtown. The scent always came back. Neighbors didn't help. A pair of teenagers biking past slowed down to gawk. David caught one mutter to the other, "Bet he doesn't last the month." At the diner, a woman gave him a pitying look and said, "You don't fix a place like that. It fixes you." He laughed it off in public, but at night those words repeated in his mind. Sleep came in fits. The house seemed louder in the dark, floorboards groaning like footsteps, pipes whispering in the walls. More than once he woke, drenched in sweat, certain he'd heard movement upstairs. Each time he found nothing but silence and the locked door waiting at the end of the hall. David doubled down, telling himself he wouldn't be run off by gossip or creaks. Yet as he hammered nails into a new window frame one afternoon, his eyes drifted back up the staircase. The thought dug deeper. If he wanted peace, he'd have to know. And the house seemed to know he was getting closer. By now, everyone in town seemed to have an opinion about David and his bargain house. At the hardware store, two men lingered near the counter as David paid for lumber. One shook his head. "Waste of money. That place doesn't want fixing." The other smirked, adding, "Better men than him walked away from it." At the diner, he overheard two women at the next booth. "He's living there? Alone?" one whispered. The other leaned in. "Doesn't he know why no one touched it?" "Everyone knows." They glanced at him quickly, then lowered their voices, as if afraid the walls themselves might be listening. Even kids chimed in. A pair of teenagers shouted across the street as David carried groceries inside. "Hey, mister, open the door yet?" They laughed, pedaling away before he could answer. Every comment, every sideways glance chipped at his patience. Yet, buried under the irritation, curiosity bloomed. What did they all know that he didn't? Why did every word, every warning circle back to the same thing, the locked room upstairs? Instead of deterring him, the gossip sharpened his resolve. If they wanted him scared off, it wouldn't work. He was going to find out what they were hiding, and the house, silent, waiting, seemed to hum with approval. The locked door at the end of the upstairs hall had become the axis of David's new life. No matter how hard he tried to ignore it, his eyes always drifted back to it, while brushing his teeth, hauling tools, or carrying laundry. It wasn't just a door anymore. It was a presence. He examined it more closely one afternoon. The wood was darker than the others, almost oily, the grain rough like it had been scorched or treated with something heavy. The lock itself wasn't modern, a brass fixture with scratches etched deeper on the keyhole, as though many hands had tried and failed to force it open. The frame told its own story. The trim bore faint gouges, little marks that looked like pry attempts. At the base of the door, faint water stains spread outward into the floorboards, warped into subtle ripples. When he pressed his ear against the wood, he expected silence, but instead heard something stranger, a faint hum, low and steady, like air moving in a space that shouldn't breathe. That night, curiosity pushed him further. He crouched low and peered through the thin crack at the bottom. The air that drifted out was cold, unnaturally cold compared to the rest of the house. And with it came that smell again, metallic and damp, almost coppery, a scent that coated the back of his throat. David pulled back quickly, heart pounding. His flashlight beam lingered on the door handle. For a moment, he swore it twitched. He bought tools the next morning, crowbars, heavy screwdrivers, anything that might give him leverage. But each time he approached, his hand stalled. Something about the silence behind the door made his chest tighten, like the house was daring him to cross a line. In town, the gossip only fueled him. "Don't open it," one man warned flatly at the gas station. "That room was sealed for a reason." Another muttered, "He'll learn the hard way, just like the last one." The last one? David wanted to ask, but before he could, the man walked away. The locked door wasn't just a quirk of an old house. It was the reason he'd gotten it for $1,800. And every nerve in his body screamed that opening it would change everything. The house began to press harder against David's nerves. What had once been small annoyances, creaks, smells, shadows, now felt deliberate. At night, the tapping grew louder, sharper, like knuckles against wood. Sometimes it came from the walls, other times directly from the locked door. Once, at 3 a.m., he woke to find the upstairs hall light on, though he hadn't flipped the switch. The glow poured from under the locked door too, faint but real, fading the moment he approached. Objects shifted. His hammer, left in the kitchen, appeared upstairs near the hallway. A stack of mail he'd sorted lay scattered by the stairwell. The mirror that had leaned face down at the end of the hall now stood upright, uncovered, reflecting the locked door perfectly. The smell became unbearable, stronger each day, metallic and wet, until David gagged when he lingered too close. He opened windows, aired out the house, scrubbed floors with bleach. Nothing worked. The odor always returned, pouring from that sealed room. Even the locals' warnings escalated. A man at the bar leaned close, whispering, "Don't go past that door, boy. You don't want what's in there following you out." His breath stank of whiskey, but his eyes were sharp with fear. By then, David knew it wasn't a question of if. It was when. The house was cornering him, piece by piece, stripping away excuses until only one remained: open the door. And soon, he would. David reached his breaking point on a stormy Thursday night. Rain pelted the roof like stones, thunder rattled the window panes, and still the house's noises cut through it all. The tapping behind the door, the low hum vibrating faintly through the floor. He sat on the living room couch, flashlight in one hand, crowbar in the other, heart pounding with a rhythm that matched the storm outside. For hours he argued with himself. Leave it alone. Fix the roof instead. Sell the place. But every counter-argument collapsed under the same truth. The house wasn't going to let him live normally until he faced what was upstairs. It was as if the door had been whispering to him, soft but constant, chipping at his sanity. He prepped like a man, about to cross enemy lines. He tightened his gloves, strapped a tool belt around his waist, and set his phone to record, half-jokingly telling himself that if something went wrong, at least someone would know what happened. He shoved a rag into his back pocket, already bracing for the smell. Before heading up, he poured himself a shot of cheap whiskey from the half-empty bottle on the counter. The liquid burned going down, steadied his nerves just enough to put one foot on the staircase. Each step groaned under his weight, louder than usual, like the house was protesting. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched longer than he remembered. The shadows deepened, and the air grew colder. He stopped at the locked door, crowbar gripped tight. The brass handle glistened faintly in the flashlight's beam, wet with condensation as though the door itself were sweating. He crouched, pressing his ear against the wood. Silence, then the faintest scrape from inside, like something shifting in the dark. David pulled back, exhaling hard, sweat dampening his collar despite the chill. His hands shook, but he wedged the crowbar against the frame. The lock groaned. Wood splintered. The noise rang through the house like a scream. And in that moment, David realized there was no turning back. The lock gave with a crack that echoed down the hall, sharp as gunfire. Dust fell from the ceiling, and the brass handle swung loose. David's crowbar slipped as the door inched open, exhaling a draft so cold it stung his face. The smell hit instantly, metallic, damp, suffocating. His stomach lurched, eyes watering as he pulled his shirt over his nose. The air that poured out wasn't just cold, it felt heavy, pressing against his skin like invisible hands. The flashlight beam trembled as he raised it. The door creaked wider, revealing a slice of black so thick it swallowed the light. David stepped back, breathing hard, every instinct screaming to slam it shut. But curiosity, no, obsession, dragged him forward. With one final push, the door swung open. The hinges shrieked, and the darkness inside stretched before him like a throat waiting to swallow. The house was silent now, too silent, as if holding its breath. And David stepped inside. The flashlight beam cut through layers of dust, the air thick and swirling like smoke. David coughed, gagging against the metallic stench that clung to his tongue. It wasn't just rot. It was older, sharper, like the tang of iron left to rust and water. The room was narrow, deeper than it looked from outside, the walls damp and streaked with black stains. The wallpaper had long since peeled away, curling like parchment, exposing wood that seemed darker than the rest of the house. His boots stuck slightly to the floor with every step, as though something had seeped into the boards and never dried. Against the far wall stood a desk, its surface hidden beneath a mound of dust so thick it looked like ash. Papers were scattered across it, brittle and yellowed, corners curled with age. A lamp, shattered, leaned at an odd angle. But it wasn't the desk that held his gaze. The center of the room was marked by a circle carved directly into the wood, its edges burned and blackened. Strange symbols ran along the grooves, unfamiliar and unsettling, their shapes jagged like broken glass. At its center sat a mound of objects, bones, small and fragile, piled in a way that made his stomach twist. David froze. His flashlight shook in his hand, throwing long shadows across the walls. He told himself they were animal bones, that he was looking at the remnants of some long-dead creature. But deep down, he knew better. The temperature dropped further, his breath fogged in the beam of light. Behind him, the door creaked softly, moving on its own as though it wanted to close again, to trap him in with whatever had been left here. A sound followed, low, steady, like a sigh rising from beneath the floorboards. David tightened his grip on the crowbar. His mouth was dry, his chest heavy. This wasn't just a locked room. It was something else entirely, something meant to stay hidden. And now, it wasn't. David edged closer, his boots dragging against the sticky floorboards. The circle in the wood seemed to pulse under his flashlight, the carved lines catching the light like fresh cuts. His breath rattled in his chest as he leaned down, fingers trembling, brushing dust from the scattered papers on the desk. They weren't bills or old letters. They were notes, scribbled in cramped handwriting, ink-smeared, margins filled with strange symbols that matched those carved into the floor. Words repeated over and over. Seal, contain, never open. His light drifted back to the mound in the center of the circle. Bones. Yes, but not just animal. Some were unmistakably human-sized, small enough to be a child's hand, fragile enough to crumble if touched. They weren't scattered randomly. They were arranged, piled deliberately, as though part of something ritualistic. The cold in the room deepened, seeping through his gloves. For a moment, David swore he heard a whisper. Not from outside, not from the hall, but from the circle itself, a voice rising with the sigh beneath the boards. The realization hit him like a punch. This room wasn't just locked to keep people out. It had been sealed to keep something in, and by forcing the door, David had broken the only barrier that held it back. The next morning, David stumbled into town, pale and shaken, clothes still carrying that metallic stench he couldn't wash out. He sat in the diner, nursing a coffee he didn't touch. People noticed immediately. Conversations dipped, eyes followed him. The whispers he once brushed off now swelled into a chorus. Finally, an older man slid into the booth across from him without asking. His name was Clyde. White hair, thick hands calloused from decades of work. He stared hard at David. "You opened it, didn't you?" David didn't answer, but his silence said enough. Clyde leaned back, sighing. "We kept that place shut for a reason. It wasn't just rot in there. It was a sickness. Started with the first owner. Man kept hearing voices, claimed they came from the walls. By the time anyone stepped in, he'd carved those symbols into the floor, swearing it was the only way to contain what was living beneath." Another patron, a woman with sharp eyes, chimed in from the next booth. "People died in that house. Not just him. Kids went missing. Pets too. Nobody could prove it, but everyone knew. So they sealed it, nailed the door, left it to rot. Better a locked room than another funeral." The theories spilled out, now that the secret was cracked. Some swore it was a curse left by the land's original owners. Others whispered about rituals gone wrong, about blood spilled in exchange for bargains no one wanted to admit. A few believed the house itself was alive, feeding on whoever dared to live inside. David sat frozen, coffee untouched, the words slamming into him one by one. They hadn't warned him to protect the house. They'd warned him to protect himself. And now, everyone in that diner knew. The seal was broken. The looks they gave him weren't pity anymore. They were fear. David returned to the house that night, the key trembling in his hand as he slid it into the front door. The walls seemed to exhale as he stepped inside, the air colder than ever, thick with that metallic tang. Upstairs, the locked door no longer resisted. It hung slightly ajar, groaning on its hinges as though eager to welcome him back. He stood in the hallway for what felt like hours, staring at that dark opening. Every nerve screamed to leave, to run, to never set foot inside again. But he also knew something vital. Whatever had been trapped in that room for decades was no longer sealed. The house creaked around him. Shadows stretched where no light touched. Somewhere deep below, the hum rose again, steady, patient, waiting. David tightened his grip on the crowbar, but it felt useless now, like a child's toy against something vast. And in that silence, a single truth echoed through his mind. Some doors are locked for a reason, and once opened, they never truly close. And that's the chilling tale of David's $1,800 home, a bargain that came with a secret no one dared to face. The room was sealed for a reason, but once opened, it could never be closed again. What do you think was really trapped inside? Drop your theories in the comments. And if this story left you with chills, hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you never miss another mystery. Share this video with someone who loves true crime and urban legends, because the more we talk about these stories, the less likely they are to stay buried.